Okay. Go ahead. You're on.
I want to go back to the 1930s, the time I started to go to the mountains with my mother and my brother Jimmy. We went up to a place in Glenwild called the Jaffe House, and my neighbors who were with us at that time, my good friends, the Lifters. There was Buddy and his sister Rosalie and his brother Joe. We used to call him Tootie. And there was a little bit of a mud hole up there, and we had a big wash tub, and we made it into a boat, and we used to paddle around in that little mud hole of a pool, which was a natural pool, and that was, in that particular time, the deepest part of it was no more than 4 feet, and we learned how to swim at that particular time in that little pool. Later on, we went up to a much larger lake up the road, and I forget the name of the lake. And I learned how to swim in deep water. Up until that point, we only swam in this little mud hole. Later on, during the summer months, we used to take the trolley car and go to Coney Island, and it was during the polio season, so we would swim in a pool which was chlorinated. We would never go near the ocean, and we spent the whole day at the pool, and then we take the elevated train back to Borough Park.
When you say it was polio season, though, why? Because you could get polio from the ocean?
The ocean was polluted, and everybody was afraid of polio at that particular time. It was a scourge. The fact of the matter is, my mother made me a little sack which I wore around my neck with camphor in it, which you thought would ward off the polio. It was strictly an amulet, which was strictly an old wives' tale. Anyhow, then what happened when I got to be about 14, I was never a Boy Scout, but I found out that some friend of mine belonged to a troop on Avenue F in East 2nd Street, which was about 20 blocks away from where we lived. And I found out it would cost $10 for 2 weeks, $15 for 2 weeks at Boy Scout camp. And I wasn't looking forward to spending the entire summer around Borough Park, which was pretty hot. I didn't want to go to Coney Island anymore. I wanted to go to camp. So I became a tenderfoot fast. That's the first rank of becoming a Boy Scout. I learned how to tie some knots, and I became a member of Troop 91, and I was able to go off to Boy Scout camp. I went the first 2 weeks I went off to Boy Scout camp. I convinced my cousin Buddy to come along with me, and we both went. And the first 2 weeks were $15, and every week thereafter was $10. It was quite rustic.
Where was it?
It was up in Narrowsburg, New York. It was a little town. Narrowsburg was about 7 miles from the Boy Scout camp. The Boy Scout camp was part of the Harriman estate, which was donated to the Boy Scouts. I don't know, about 14,000 acres with a tremendous lake. It was called Rock Lake. And there were about 15 camps they were built around the lake. They were all part of the Brooklyn Boy Scout camps. And there was only one kosher camp, which was at the end of the trail, which was called Saget, Camp Saget. So we went to the kosher camp. And Buddy only stayed for about 2 weeks because his brother's partner, a man by the name of Nadler, was very active in the Henry Street settlement, and he wanted Buddy to go to the Henry Street settlement camp, which was up in Beacon, New York. So he spent 2 weeks with me at Boy Scout camp, and then he went. Then I stayed on my own. While I was at Boy Scout camp for about 5 weeks, in order to become a second-class scout, you had to first, after becoming a 10-foot, there was second class, first class, and after you got first class scout, you got a certain number of merit badges, and you became 5 merit badges was a Star Scout, 10 merit badges was a Life Scout, and 21 merit badges you became an Eagle Scout, which was the highest rank. And then after that, different merit badges you would get what they call palm leaves. Anyhow, I never got more than two. That's a story that goes later on. But while I was at Boy Scout camp, I became rather homesick. And I knew that my brother Henry had a summer job as a drummer in a band in Huntington, New York, which was about 30 miles from Boy Scout camp. So I told the scoutmaster that I was going with a friend of mine to get the requirements of a 14-mile hike, 7 miles each way. I was going to take a hike to Narrowsburg. So instead of hiking to Narrowsburg, we hitchhiked to Huntington, New York. And when I got to Huntington, New York, I found out Henry had left. Instead of staying a whole summer, my father had a sinus attack, and his eyes swelled up, and he was in bed, and they were quite worried about it, because the year before that, 2 years before that rather, one of my cousins in Asbury Park, a young man of 21, Nathan Banker, had a sinus attack. It was before the days of penicillin and any other thing. It went to his brain and he died. So they were very, very aggravated, worried about my dad with this sinus attack, and his face swelled up and his eyes swelled up. So I was quite worried, and I went back to camp, and I stayed overnight at Huntington. And the scoutmaster was beside himself. 2 of his scouts were missing. He didn't know what happened to him. And now, as I think back, I can realize what I put him through. So he called up headquarters, which was about 2 miles away from the camp on a lake. It was called Tahlequah. And he spoke to Chief Lindsay, and he said these 2 boys should be sent home from camp, because they caused us a tremendous amount of aggravation.
So was that already at the end of your 5th week?
No, I was at 5 weeks. After 5 weeks, I was sent home.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
I was sent home from camp.
Well, also I have a question. When you, since you originally only signed up for 2 weeks, how did you extend it? Did you call home and they said,
no.
Or?
All you had to do was send in the $10, and you could stay on as long as you want. It wasn't like the scout camp in Rockland County where you signed on for 2 weeks and all you could stay was 2 weeks. You can stay as long as you wanted, as long as you paid the tuition, which was $10 a week. Anyhow, the following summer, which was 1935.
Oh, so they sent you home.
They sent me home, but nothing happened. I continued in scouting, all at Troop 91, and I continued in scouting. I used to go to meetings every Friday night. And the following summer, I went back, and they had a new camp master, scout master. It was an art teacher in one of the schools in New York. His name was Jack Goldstein. He was a wonderful man. I was 15 years old, and I came back to camp, and some of the boys knew me already from previous years, because most of the boys at Boy Scout camp were 12, and some of them were even younger than that. So when he saw me lined up at the assembly, he said, "We need another patrol leader. We'd like you to become a patrol leader." So to be a patrol leader, you were only paid $4 a week, and you were in charge of the tent.
Okay,
And so that summer, it cost my folks $4 a week. Following summer, which was 1936, and all the time that I was at Boy Scout camp, I kept on taking various tests. And I became a first-class scout while I was at Boy Scout camp. Now, as I said, once you became a first-class scout, you had to draw a map. I drew a map on scale of Prospect Park. And you had to do other things. You had to learn first aid. You had to pass a certain swimming test. And while I was at Boy Scout camp, I had to swim a half a mile, because the lake was a mile wide and about 3 miles long. So you had to be able to swim a half a mile. So you would always be able to. And you had to tip a canoe and fill it up with water, and then get into it and paddle back and disrobe in the water. That was part of your life-saving test. To become a junior lifesaver. Anyway, junior lifeguard, I should say. Anyhow, the following year, which was 1936, I went back to Boy Scout camp, and at that time they made me what is known as an activities counselor. I was a nature counselor, and I slept in a tent. Normally the tents held 10 cots, and I slept in a tent which was for the counselors, which was two beds and 2 bunks in that particular bed, in that particular tent. It was up on the platform, and I was the nature counselor, and one of the other men with me, I forget his name, was an activities counselor for our group. And as a nature counselor, a few times a week, I used to get up about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we were not too far from the Delaware River, and I used to go down with a pair of binoculars, and all those. In order to pass bird study, you had to be able to identify 40 birds, their calls, their colors, and various concerning their habitat. And you had to see those birds. So we used to go down. I used to get up early in the morning with some of the men that were interested in passing that particular merit badge, and view the birds along the Delaware. Anyhow, that summer, I managed to get most of my requirements to become an Eagle Scout. I passed all my bird study, and at the end of the camp season, I was awarded my badge, my Eagle badge. And then, at that time, I was 16 years old already, and it was time for me, the summertime, to do something more productive. So over the summertime, I started to work in my father's place, the photography place, and I started in my dad's place. I was 16 years old, then we went to. A cousin of mine named Joe Marchand, first cousin, my father's sister Annie's son, Joe, was a baby photographer. So my dad bought me a Graflex, a 3 1/4, 4 1/4 Graflex camera, which was perfect for taking home portraits of children. So I went around with Joe when I was 16 to learn how to approach people to have me take pictures of their children. Then at 17, that summer, my folks went up to Spring Valley, and because Pop had asthma, and then they figured going to Spring Valley would actually help his asthma. He'd be out of the city, so he used to commute every day with the Erie Railroad. He picked it up at Chambers Street and took the ferry over to Jersey City, and we picked up the Erie Railroad, and it used to stop at Spring Valley. And at Spring Valley, we had a car parked the car at the station, and used to drive. We had a place in Pomona. We rented a little farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards, and there was a big cider mill right next door. Anyhow, and that's
Is that a long commute?
took about an hour.
Oh, that's also, that's
We used
not
to stop
bad.
at every little town,
Mhm.
Nanuet, Pearl River, and all these little towns that we became familiar with when we lived in Rockland County. I never dreamed at that time that I would ever live in Rockland County. At that time, I was 17 years old, and I was working, taking baby pictures, and I had set up a dark room downstairs in my mother's house. I built it myself, and we'd go out and walk the streets with the camera, and I'd carry a floodlight, and I'd approach a woman on the street and I'd give her a whole story, telling her we were opening up a studio in the neighborhood, and it would be absolutely free, no obligation to her. We needed pictures from the window. We'd be too glad to take pictures of their children. So we'd go up and I'd take one of the vanity benches, I'd stick the kid on the vanity bench, and I'd take the chair and I'd clip the flash light. It wasn't a flash bulb, it was a photo floodlight.
Mhm.
With a reflector. I'd shine in the kid's face, and time was the 25th of a second. And I had a rubber ball attached to it, and I used to give him the old gitchy whoop. I used to get him to smile. I used to tuck their foot underneath, one foot underneath the other, so they were sitting in a cute position, and I would take several pictures. And a couple of days later, I would go back with the prints, proofs, and I'd show they were contact prints because they were 3 1/4, 4 1/4. It was a fairly good size. And I tell them that there were no obligation to buy them, but if they liked the pictures, I would sell them the enlargements. I would take the enlargements. I would take the prints. They decided to have it done. How much was it? It was about $2 in that 5x7.
Mm-hmm.
And I would try to sell them a frame too.
Uh-huh.
Anyhow.
Did you make a buck?
I made some money, but what happened was there was a fellow who lived a block away. His name was Schwartz. I can't remember his first name. He was an excellent photographer, and he had a tremendous studio down in his basement,
mm-hmm.
and he was able to make composite prints.
Mm-hmm.
So I became very friendly with him,
mm-hmm.
and I would take some of my negatives over, and he would do me a favor. He would take, instead of individual prints put onto an 8x10 or a 10/16 piece of photographic paper, individual pictures, he would make a composite. He would take each pose and put it on the same paper, and he would put a background in the back artistically, and you've seen them. They were called composite pictures, and then I would have them framed and try to, and of course, I got a fairly good price for it. Pop couldn't do it because his setup wasn't adapted for that type of a negative.
Mm-hmm. So, what about, you were going to tell us about a trip to, I forget what town it was, that you went with your whole family, a vacation? With mom to, no, it wasn't Ontario, you were talking about this morning?
No.
About a trip?
What happened was, when I was 16 and still in scouting, and Buddy was in scouting too, but Buddy never got hired to be a second class scout. He never was really ambitious about going into scouting. So what we did was surreptitiously, we told my folks that we were to going up for a long weekend up to Boy Scout camp. They had a camp up at outside of Tuxedo. I forget the town. That was part of Brooklyn Boy Scout camp that used to go up on weekends. So I told them we were going up there, but the truth of the matter is we concocted a route from Yonkers. We were going to go take a hitchhike all the way up to Montreal. That was long before Buddy ever knew Sonny, who lived in Montreal, and we got to meet her later on. So we hitchhiked up there, and while I was up there, I wasn't feeling too well, and we were up there for about 4 days, and we hitchhiked back, and I remember very clearly we were about 20 miles out of Montreal, and it started to rain, and we had these big packs. We expected to be camping out, but when we got up to Montreal, we stayed at a hotel. It cost us $3 a night, and we hitchhiked home. And fortunately, some fellow in a big LaSalle, which was at that time was like a Cadillac. It was made by General Motors, and this fellow picked us up, and we were so thrilled. He was going all the way to Yonkers, and we had meeting. He stopped in Saratoga, and he said to us, "Do you boys want something to eat?" So he took us into a restaurant, and it was the first good meal we had in I don't know how long. And finally, we got home very late that night. We hitchhiked from Yonkers back into New York City, and we took train, subway back home. I got home. I was running a temperature, and I got into bed. And I never told my parents where we had gone. But the following, this was.
Wait, what did you do while you were in Montreal? Do you remember?
We walked around we went to different places, and.
Whorehouse.
No, but that's 16 years old. I wasn't. I knew about that, but I didn't do that until later on. Well, what happened was. That same year, it was 1936. We told our parents that we would hitchhike to Washington D.C. So we hitchhiked to Washington D.C. and we went into. That was during the Roosevelt administration, as I mentioned it before. You were able to walk right up to the White House, and I remember seeing Eleanor Roosevelt get into the car, and you didn't get the kind of crowds in Washington, D.C. that you get today. This is back in 1936. And I remember waiting in line to get into the Supreme Court. That was when they had what was known as the 9 old men. That was there was a big controversy that Roosevelt wanted to pack the court because the court was so conservative, and they were knocking down all his legislation, which was had to do with getting the country moving again. Mommy had mentioned the WPA, and with the AAA, and with the alphabet soup they called it. Different types of programs. The CCA, the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were reforesting the country and planting trees and so on and so forth. Anyhow, after we came back from Washington, and we stayed in some flea bag hotel where, of course, there's practically nothing. And And then while I was 16 years old at the time, at that time I'd already started working for my dad, as I mentioned before, and going to high school, and then going on to, and while I was in junior high, you asked me before what I did, whether I played any sports. I was on the, I played basketball and I played softball. We had softball tournaments, and we had basketball tournaments, intramural basketball tournaments, and I was on the basketball team. And I
Oh, and also
played
you said you had a club?
And then, of course, we had a club when I was about 15 called the Cubs AC. And my friend Harold Sowell, who lived up the street, his father was in the, had a haberdashery store. And he contacted a sporting goods store, and they made us up these jackets. They were black jackets with gold piping around the sleeves, and a big gold basketball that said Cubs AC, Cubs Athletic, and I was so proud of that jacket. And there must have been about 10 of us, and we used to play sports on the streets, stick ball and
Can we get to
Okay,
college?